The Second World War, to a greater extent, is considered a symbol of Hitler's Nazism, and all of the atrocities that were committed in the conquered Europe are at the forefront of both history textbooks and scientific research. Against this background, the actions of Germany's ally Japan are not so well known, although what the Japanese military did in the occupied territories sometimes simply contradicts all understanding and cannot be perceived by any sane person. The fate of the Allied of prisoners of war. During the entire war, in the Pacific theater of military operations, at least 140,000 soldiers, officers, and medical personnel of the United States, Australia, Canada, Britain, New Zealand, and India were captured by the Japanese. Since Japan did not sign the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war, the fate of the latter was, to put it mildly, terrible. Many hundreds lost their arms and legs, some as a result of medical experiments, others as a result of lack of proper medical care. As a rule, prisoners of war were used in coal mines and road construction. Conditions were not just terrible but horrendous. Prisoners could be kept either in pits which were closed with lids, or in flimsy barracks which did not protect either from cold or from the heat. For example, the well-known Thai-Burma Railway was built, among other things, by the hands of prisoners of war of the Allied forces. The total length is 415 kilometers. During the construction period, at least 100,000 Asians and prisoners of war died from inhumane conditions. No wonder this road is called the Road of Death. In one of the camps, the Japanese Lieutenant Usuk, who among the prisoners received the nickname Black Prince, became famous for his incredible sadism. For fun, during the construction of the railway, he beat prisoners to death, and once in front of other prisoners, he cut off the head of the unfortunate man who was trying to escape. The second in terms of atrocities was the Japanese version of the infamous Dr. Death Mengele in Europe, Surgeon Seiichi Okada. The prisoners of war even called him the same way, Dr. Death. Loving the torture of prisoners of war, the surgeon preferred his most favorite method. A gallon of water was poured into the unfortunate man through the anus, and then Dr. Death began to jump on his belly swollen with water. After such torture, no one survived. Some died in terrible agony right during this Inquisition. And speaking about the conditions of treatment of prisoners of war, it is impossible not to say about how the Japanese treated the prisoners immediately after their capture. During the so-called Battle of Hong Kong, the British, together with the Portuguese, Chinese, and Asians, repelled the attacks of the Japanese units for several days. Just before the Christmas holidays, the defenders were surrounded on the Stanley Peninsula and captured. Immediately after that, the wounded were not just killed, but butchered. Many were stabbed to death or bayoneted. The Japanese executed the prisoners regardless of their skin color and origin. They butchered everyone. Medical workers, citizens of Britain and China, suffered the most. All of them were brutally raped, and many died right during the inhumane action. The survivors were stabbed with bayonets. Some had their heads cut off. Therefore, it is not surprising that when the scales of war leaned on the side of the Allied troops, neither the Americans, nor the Canadians, nor other members of the Allied troops were merciful to the Japanese. And with all the cruelty of the treatment of prisoners, it should be noted that nobody ever jumped on their stomachs or cut off their limbs. The fate of the captured Koreans. Unfortunately, this moment in the history of World War II is practically unknown. However, what the prisoners of the concentration camps, specifically of Korean nationality, experienced also strikes the imagination of any normal and adequate person. As one of the Korean citizens said, the Japanese killed the Koreans without any ideology, only on the basis of ethnicity. In addition to physical torture, the Japanese also used psychological torment on the Koreans. So, in the basement where the unfortunate were tortured, there were cells on the level below, where the prisoners had to sit motionless in the lotus position. At the same time, thanks to the special acoustics, it was impossible not to hear the screams of the tortured people. And the Japanese tortured, to put it mildly, more than cruelly. Fingernails were torn out with special devices. Men's organs were bitten off. Fingers and entire limbs were amputated. and ears and noses were cut off. In addition to the unbearable working condition in the concentration camp, special systems for punishment for any offenses were developed for the Koreans. The most simple was the placement of the guilty person in a coffin, which was sealed and placed vertically. The coffin was in a room where not a sound could be heard. As the result, the unfortunate person, being there for several days, ceased to understand whether he was still above the ground or whether he had been buried a long time ago, having left a small air supply somewhere. No doubts that, as a rule, such torture led to rapid insanity. The barrel was another form of punishment. A prisoner was placed in it and left for several days. However, with the seeming mercy of punishment, it was terrible. The fact is that from the inside, the barrel was studded with either sharp spikes or glass fragments, so any careless movement led to wounds. And sitting motionless for hours and days was horrible torture. Many of the prisoners, trying to escape their torment, purposefully began to move around in the barrel to inflict as many wounds as possible, and with any luck to die from blood loss. One can only imagine how desperate people must be to try to ensure an easy death this way. And it was certainly not easy, unless compared with what was happening outside the barrel. Finally, no matter how cynically it sounds, the most humane for the Korean prisoners was hanging. Many openly rejoiced that their torment would soon end. Therefore, quite a few cases are known when Koreans before execution were asked to change their minds about hanging and save their lives. But the prisoners preferred to choose the noose because they understood that such a death is better than life in hell. After all, you never know at what point the finger of a Japanese guard will point at you, and then you will be dragged to the torture cellar or locked in a coffin. Experiments on the Chinese. Concentration camps in the classical sense did not exist in the occupied territory of China. The Japanese simply slaughtered the population mercilessly, with no intention of keeping them somewhere. The only exceptions could be those who were used to work in coal and stone mines, as well as the construction of roads and facilities. The so-called units were a terrible analog of concentration camps. The most famous of them is Unit 731. Unlike the German concentration camps, in such units, the level of atrocities went beyond human perception. The experiments that were carried out on the prisoners are striking in their savagery. For example, so-called Japanese scientists investigated the level of resistance of the human body. Prisoners were shocked, doused with boiling water, exposed to the cold, deprived of water and food. At the same time, the Japanese scrupulously recorded when the unfortunate people died. Ultimately, it was concluded that humans are on the same board as pigeons in terms of survival, since the latter showed approximately the same result in time under similar conditions. Prisoners also became experimental samples in testing various medicines, and after some time of taking the drug, the Japanese performed an autopsy without anesthesia to find out how effective the drug was. Of course, it was not without the traditional for Nazi procedures, such as amputation of limbs, contamination of wounds with infections, and after observing the torment of prisoners. The prisoners were infected with all known pathogens, such as plague, syphilis, typhoid fever, anthrax, and even horse blood was poured in them. Also, the prisoners were subjected to constant exposure to X-rays. They were boiled alive in boilers, and especially often dehydrated. The horror was that the hidden or dismembered bodies belonged to still living people. But the Japanese pseudo-doctors did not even consider it necessary to sew them up. On the contrary, in this so-called open mode, they observed what processes were taking place in the internal organs of a person. Some prisoners received gunshot wounds on purpose, for example in the abdomen or stomach, and then Japanese doctors trained to remove the bullet. Of course, there was no question of any anesthesia. One of the most common experiments was cutting out the liver of living prisoners. All this was done solely in order to determine the limit of endurance of human body. There is a known case when a prisoner of war for some fault, possibly an attempt to escape, was tied to a tree, his arms and legs were pulled out, his torso was cut, and then his heart was cut out. After that incident, although this torture did not become widespread, however, in many units, Japanese executioners adopted it. The level of madness of Japanese pseudoscientists and doctors exceeded all limits of understanding. How can one comprehend the fact that prisoners had either organ or even part of their brain removed and heartlessly observed as the process of either recovery or of gradual death of the unfortunate person took place. Therefore, it is not surprising that the prisoners who got into one of these units considered it a great success if they were sent to their death in the gas chamber. It is wild to perceive this, but the unfortunate sincerely believe that a painful death from suffocation is much more preferable than many days of torment in the barracks for the infected or on the operating table.